So hi, my name is Lindsay Syhakhom. I'm a solutions architect at Logicworks. What that means is essentially I help customers migrate to the cloud day in, day out. And today I'm going to be talking about achieving and automating PCI compliance. So this is going to be an educational presentation, basically just sharing my experience in the trenches, helping customers figure out PCI compliance on major hyperscale public cloud platforms. So just our agenda today, I'm going to start by talking about who's responsible for compliance in the cloud. That's kind of the first question most of our customers ask us. What are the specific controls I need to implement on the public cloud to meet PCI standards? Next, what are some common questions around implementing PCI in the cloud? And finally, automating compliance. So it was great to see so many automation-focused presentations today, so I'm going to touch on that a little bit as well. So just a little bit about me and Logicworks. So Logicworks is a leader in cloud migration and managed services. We're a cloud consultant. We're a leader in the Gartner Magic Quadrant for public cloud professional managed services, and we deal with AWS and Azure, essentially. Our focus area is really on highly regulated industries. So about 80% of our customers are in financial services, fintech, SaaS platforms, or healthcare. So PCI is obviously an audit Logicworks goes through annually and have since 2007. And we also help our customers go through these audits. So again, I'm kind of sharing in the trenches knowledge of what we've learned across all of these customers you see on this slide. So when we start to talk about compliance maturity, the first step is really defining what controls do we need to implement in the cloud? What are the actual PCI controls that we have, and how do we map those to what that looks like on AWS or Azure or Google, right? Next, we want to go to the implementation phase. How do we figure out what specific AWS, Azure services or third-party tools we need to implement to meet this PCI requirement? Next, how do we document this process? So for all the IT professionals on the call who have gone through PCI audits, you know that about 50% of it is actually the technical control you have to meet, but the other 50% of it is just documenting the control. So I'll talk about that briefly. And next, enforcing the control. So all the automation tools that people have discussed today on the call, on this webinar, will certainly fall under that enforcement phase. And finally, the evolution phase. So compliance is never one and done, right? We always go through compliance every year. So how can we improve compliance over time? So as I go through this story, I think it'll be helpful to kind of bring it to life a little bit to have a customer example. So Numerics is a capital markets technology SaaS company. They were running on-prem software installed in their customers' data centers. And they came to Logicworks saying, hey, we really want to migrate to AWS. We want to kind of SaaSify our application, right? Offer it as a cloud-based SaaS application. But we maintain PCI in our data centers, but we have no idea what that might look like in AWS. And so they came to Logicworks to kind of get guidance on what that might look like during their migration process. So one of the first questions that they asked us was, who's responsible for compliance? You know, they had a PCI attestation of compliance in their data center. They knew that AWS had an attestation of compliance. Did that mean that if Numerics just moved to AWS, they were automatically PCI compliant? And the answer to that, unfortunately, is no, right? If you migrate to a hyperscale cloud platform, it is still your responsibility to get your own PCI certification, essentially. So what the certification on AWS is and Azure and Microsoft and Google's attestations actually mean is that their physical data center infrastructure is compliant. So let's say identity and access management, right? The actual hardware that supports that service is compliant with PCI, right? You can find the attestations of compliance for every hyperscale cloud platform basically publicly available. But the users that you put in identity and access management, whether you rotate their credentials, whether you remove access when the employee leaves, all that stuff is required by PCI and all that stuff is still your responsibility. So I thought I'd just throw this in as a kind of knowledge test. So I think quiz yourself as you're sitting listening to me. Is this thing the cloud provider responsibility, or is it the customer's responsibility or your responsibility? So the first one, getting an attestation of compliance for your organization in meeting a compliance control. And of course, I just said this, it's your responsibility to do that. Next, and this is a tricky one, hardening your operating system to align with the compliance control. So who is responsible for this, the cloud provider or you? The answer is most cases it's you, right? And that is what the difference between an infrastructure as a service and a platform as a service would differentiate on. So let's say a platform like IAM, which I just outlined, is a service where you don't touch the operating system, you don't have any level of visibility into that, so you're not responsible for it. But if you're managing a virtual machine on Azure, you're certainly responsible for hardening the operating system. Next, generating policy documentation for cybersecurity policies. Just talked about this. This is your responsibility. You still need to do all the documentation that you've always done for PCI audits. Next, maintaining a PCI report for a public cloud data center control implementations. So the keyword here is public cloud data center control, right? I just mentioned this. This is the cloud provider's responsibility, and basically their only responsibility in most cases in terms of compliance. And finally, regularly reviewing access controls and permissions. I also just mentioned this. This is your responsibility in the cloud. So let's dive into the actual phases of what compliance looks like. And again, as I said, the first phase of figuring out compliance or figuring out PCI in the cloud is defining what kind of framework you need to comply with. So when customers come to us and they've chosen PCI as their framework, it could be because they have actual regulated data in their environment. They actually manage credit card data, and so they have to comply with PCI. But actually, in the most cases, if you're a fintech SaaS platform, for instance, maybe you don't have customer data of financial or credit data actually in your platform. Maybe you've outsourced that to Stripe or some other payment provider. However, you may have a customer requesting that you're PCI compliant, or you may just think of it as a best practice standard. And the great part about PCI, and I'm going to say this a couple of times in this presentation, is PCI is prescriptive. So they give you a set of controls you have to comply with. If you meet those controls, you pass the audit. If you don't meet those controls, you fail the audit. So if you guys are familiar with SOC 2 or some of the other risk-based audits, that's more of a conversation that you have with your auditor. Do I need to meet this control, or can I get around this in some other way? In PCI, it's like, this is the list of controls, you meet it or you don't. So the next step in this definition phase is really outlining what does the actual PCI requirement mean? What is the implementation that I actually need to do to be compliant with this control? So what we do is we sit down with a customer and we say, okay, here are all the PCI requirements. Let's map that to what you actually need to do in the cloud. So requirement 5, it's probably 20 or 25 words long, but what it really means is you need antivirus. And then we think, okay, so is there a cloud native tool on AWS or Azure that meets this requirement? The answer is no. Most public cloud platforms don't have antivirus, or can't think of any that does. So we look for a third-party tool. Something like Trend Micro is a good example of probably the most popular antivirus tool. Let's look at something like requirement 1.3.4, right? Restrict unauthorized outbound traffic to the internet. A more common way of saying this is implement egress filtering, right? So you could do this with a Palo Alto egress firewall. You could do this with a network firewall or Azure firewall. So all of these things, this step is really about coming up with that really concise list of requirements and mapping that to what you actually need to do in the cloud. I encourage you, if you're an IT professional that's looking to migrate to the cloud and trying to figure out this mapping, take a screenshot of this slide because this is pretty comprehensive in terms of the actual tools you need to implement. That doesn't include processes and practices, obviously. Great, so the next phase is the implementation phase. So we figured out exactly what we need to implement. Let's implement it. So here's a sample architecture diagram. So I brought up numerics at the beginning of this call as kind of the case study we're going to walk through. So this is not numerics' architecture diagram, but it's kind of representative of what they were thinking. So a couple key things that I'd like to point out here. And although this is technically an AWS architecture diagram, the principles are still going to be the same, whatever cloud provider that you're using. So first, notice this web application firewall here. This is basically the central ingress point into the application. Notice also, secondly, that there are no resources in public subnets except for load balancers and bastion hosts. That's very important. A lot of customers come to us and say, hey, all of our stuff is in a public subnet, or all our stuff is in a public network. We didn't realize, we had to do some network segmentation. Notice that all other resources are in private networks. And this red line is indicative of a security group or a layer 4 or 3 or 4 firewall surrounding these resources. The last thing I'll point out here for PCI is all these deployed security services over here. Threat Stack is an IDS IPS tool. Trend Micro, again, is antivirus. Duo is MFA. All of these are mostly agent-based tools installed on virtual machines. And obviously, that's a key part of meeting these compliance objectives. So let's talk quickly about some common technical questions we get in this implementation phase. And the first most common question we get is, do I actually need to purchase from a cloud provider a web application firewall, or is this security group on my load balancer enough to meet the requirement? The short answer is you need a WAF. You need a WAF unless you have, there's a kind of a little bit of a loophole. You could have an intensive security code review process to get out of this requirement. But for most customers, it just makes sense. It's a couple $100 to meet this requirement. The second most common question we get is, how about, can I bring my on-prem security tools to the cloud? And the answer is yes, you can. But we encourage you to take this opportunity when you're migrating, or maybe you're already in the cloud and you're kind of reevaluating things. Evaluate whether that tool is really cloud native and whether that tool scales economically and has all the features that you really want in a cloud environment. That would be my only word of caution. But yes, of course, you could experiment with bringing your existing on-prem security tools to the cloud. The third common question, and honestly, this is probably the #1 question we get at Logicworks, is how do I figure out egress filtering? I know this is a requirement for PCI, but what's actually the recommended architecture for figuring this out? And the answer is really, again, this is an AWS diagram, but take it across cloud platforms. Have a separate network dedicated to egress filtering. And whether that's a virtual appliance that you install in that network, like a Palo Alto, or a cloud native solution, again, like Azure Firewall or AWS Network Firewall, have that be the central egress point and use a central router, in this case, this is a transit gateway, to funnel all traffic from spoke networks through the egress network and out to the internet. Great, so the third phase, I'm not going to spend very long on this because we all know what policy documentation is and how fun it is to write, right? The fourth phase is enforcement. So again, so many great presentations today about this enforcement phase. We like to think of enforcement as 2 key areas. The first is building compliant infrastructure resources, and the second is making sure those compliant resources don't drift away from their desired configuration over time, right? So the first phase, building compliant resources. The answer here is really infrastructure as code, right? Have that network diagram that I showed you guys earlier, have that defined as a CloudFormation document or a Terraform document, so that when you go through your PCI audit, you can say, this is a living source of documentation, auditor, about how my system is configured. And not only that, but this is a living document. So if I ever had additional resources I needed to launch, I would just launch them from this template. So that way, when you're launching additional resources, all that security agents and the egress filtering and all that kind of security stuff that we need for PCI is built into that template. And the second thing is preventing configuration drift, as I said. Now, there are many cloud-native tools that do this. AWS Config Rules is a good example. Azure Policy is another great example. And really, it's about setting up managed rules so that you get alarmed when configurations on the cloud plane level itself change. The last phase is evolve. And we all know that after a PCI audit, you're not just done with PCI, unfortunately, right? This is an annual audit. So ask yourself, have you documented all the risks in the PCI audit process? Are you measuring your progress over time? Normally this means, are you automating tasks that are currently manual, right? So how did it work at Numerics? What happened with Numerics is by leveraging Logicworks and by leveraging AWS, they were able to significantly accelerate their PCI time to compliance, essentially, by using our documentation, our automation tools, that diagram I showed you as kind of a central foundation for what their architecture would look like. They also leveraged Logicworks managed services. So they have 24/7 support. That also means, you know, we have automated scanners running against their environment to make sure that they're always compliant. And finally, they do quarterly compliance assessments with us to make sure that even between audits, they're meeting PCI. So that's it. Thanks so much for listening. I hope it was helpful to hear kind of how PCI actually works on hyperscale cloud platforms. Feel free to contact me at my email address or visit our website. Thanks.